European Union has released its much-anticipated list of countries whose residents will be permitted to travel into the region starting Thursday. The countries include residents of Algeria, Australia, Canada, Georgia, Japan, Montenegro, Morocco, New Zealand, Rwanda, Serbia, South Korea, Thailand, Tunisia, and Uruguay. Nigeria and South Africa are not on the list of countries welcome to enter the EU. The COVID-19 pandemic suggests that the need to reduce Africa's high trade dependence on non-African states. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement could facilitate this, but that means intensifying the process and reducing the current 5-year timeline for liberalization of tariffs. Joining me in the studio to discuss this is the CEO of the CFG Advisory, Mr. Tilewa Adebanjo. Good afternoon to you, sir. You're welcome to the show. So how is this EU ban likely to be impacting global business? And with an already bleak global economic growth forecast projected, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think what is happening now gradually is the fact that there's a new normal. In terms of normal trade and services, I think there's not too much of a problem, in the sense that most of the people who are involved in manufacturing, export of goods and services, I think that is not affected because the supply chain and the logistics mechanisms are still intact. The people who are being seriously or adversely affected by this is the tourist industry. For instance, for most African countries like South Africa, Kenya, Morocco, Egypt, these are countries that are big on tourism, and tourism is a major aspect of their GDP. So for those countries, they are going to feel the impact of the fact that although the travel ban has been lifted, but their countries are not part of that. So it's those countries that are involved in the tourism business in Africa that are going to feel the burden of that impact. But as for goods and services, the supply chain and the logistics chain, I think, is still quite intact. And if you take a look at the value of the trade, I think that is not going to be significantly affected except you're in tourism, travel, or hospitality.
Thank you for that, sir. So within that context, let's look at the two largest economies in sub-Saharan Africa. They're not on the list, of course, talking about us and South Africa. Can you help us understand this still along the same lines, the implication, especially from an economic and business perspective?
Well, Nigeria exports oil as its main export. So oil exports are not affected. What has been affected for Nigeria is the price. So our oil exports to the EU is not affected. But for South Africa, tourism is a major source of revenue for South Africa. And if the Europeans are not coming into South Africa, then I think once South Africa, eases its own lockdown, then I think that will be a challenge. Because again, it's a two-way street. So the whole essence of bringing back trade and getting people to interact, I think there's a new normal now. And I think most businesses have adapted to working online. And so it's really, like I said, those three key industries: tourism, travel, and hospitality. That is where you're going to feel most of the impact. Nigeria is not much of a tourist destination, so it's left to be seen.
And, we understand that this will be reviewed by a couple of weeks. What are the chances of being reinstated, at least for Nigeria and South Africa? What needs to be done, in your view?
It's important that we understand how we are managing our protocols. You see, when you are managing your economy, you have to understand that everybody is under scrutiny, especially in this modern age where you have technology and the internet. So clearly, the EU is not comfortable with the way Nigeria and South Africa, in their own opinion, have been managing the pandemic protocols in terms of COVID-19. And I think if they look at the science, they might still feel that we have not reached our peak, and we've not been able to flatten our curve or to see how we are managing the pandemic. So if they believe that our curve is still on the high side or still rising, then I think they're going to use that science to make that decision. And I think it's important that we review our protocols. We make sure that those protocols are transparent and they're efficient and they're open and they're reliable. Once you have that, I don't think there's going to be a problem. They can use that as a basis to make their decisions.
Thank you for that, sir. I want to take you on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Takeoff has been postponed. Your thoughts on how that's going to progress going forward?
Well, it's important to understand the value of trade. The value of trade in Africa right now is about 780 billion. trade across the continent, both import and export. Of that value, only about 160 billion, or between 15 to 20% of our total trade is intra-Africa. And I think that is really what we're trying to redress. If you take a look at the EU, on the other hand, the value of trade within the EU, which is the largest trading bloc in the world, is $4 trillion. Now, 50%, over 50% of that $4 trillion is intra-EU trade. And I think that is where we are trying to go, to make sure that most of our trade is within Africa. The EU accounts for 15% of global exports and imports, and that's pretty significant. So if you take a look at that comparison and what we're trying to do with the African Continental Free Trade Zone, it's important that we take our trade numbers from between 10 to 20% of the total 760 billion to ensure that at least we can get our trade levels to about $1 trillion, which is 4 times less than the value of the EU. So even when we're up and running, the value of the EU trade is still 4 times more than that is what you see in Africa. And it's important that the more we do intra-African trade, the more we become less dependent on other trading blocs. And this is really where the trend is. Because if you take a look at the global trading blocs, you can see the Asian economies within China, Japan, South Korea. They're doing a lot of trade within the Asian region. And a lot of those trading blocs, I think, is what helps you to negotiate. Because if we're now going back to the WTO on a trade negotiation, instead of African countries negotiating either as ECOWAS or SADC, then if we're going as a whole African Continental Free Trade Area, then our negotiation powers, I think, are increased because we're now negotiating as a whole continent. And that can help us in terms of how we negotiate with the likes of China, the EU itself, and of course the United States. So the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or area is a very important policy that should see the increase in growth of the African economies and better integrate and give us a fairer deal on the global scale.
Thank you for that, sir. So some would say that African economies are too protectionist in their approach. If we look at the EU example, what lessons can we take from there?
A lot of lessons, actually, because they've been very successful. Not only do they have a single trade area, but they also have a single currency. As you see, we're still struggling just in West Africa to be able to implement the eco currency, and those challenges are still there. So there is a lot to learn from that. And what we can learn is the fact that you are stronger as a group. Being banded together as a whole group of Africa, we're much stronger to be able to negotiate with the rest of the world than if we're negotiating as our blocs like with ECOWAS or SADC. So it is important that we form this trading bloc to improve our capacity to close out better trade deals on favorable terms for the whole African continent as opposed to one region. And I think that this is a step in the right direction, and we'll see how that will progress in the future.
Speaking of that future, what's your thoughts on the idea of, as far as the currency is concerned, a unified currency? Countries like Nigeria having to lose their monetary independence, and leaving that up to, a central bank for that particular union or for Africa to manage that as one of the challenges to getting to that unified currency.
Well, don't forget that the EU is still the only bloc in the world that has a unified currency. And these are very advanced industrialized economies. And I think we need to reach that level of advancement and development before we look into a single currency for the African Union. What I think is more important is for us is to get our banks to be able to settle trades, our central banks to begin to settle trades in an intra-African manner. I think that is really what is more important for now. If the Nigerian Central Bank and the South African Central Bank and the Ghanaian Central Bank, for Nigerians that want to export to South Africa, I think the banking system should be able to settle those trades. The people making their payment should be able to make the payment in South Africa, in Rand, and the Nigerian should be able to collect his money here in Naira. So it is up to the central banks to come together to look at that settlement system. That is what we need to do to start now. In West Africa, we've talked about setting up an eco currency. If we start with that and we see how that works out, I think going forward, a lot more things can begin to happen.
All right. Siloa Adebajo, the CEO of CFG Advisory, thank you so much for taking us through your thoughts on the EU list of countries that will be allowed to travel in, as well as how things move forward with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement as we battle the COVID-19 pandemic and projections of a tough time ahead for African countries. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you very much.